The funeral parlor was filled with the scent of lilies and the quiet murmur of people sharing memories of my father, Thomas Davis. I sat in the front row of the ornate chapel at Riverside Memorial, wearing a simple black dress from a department store, my hands folded in my lap as I listened to speaker after speaker talk about the man who'd raised me alone after my mother's death when I was 12. Dad had been gone for 3 days now, a sudden heart attack at 67 while working in his garden, no warning signs, no chance for any of us to say goodbye. The shock was still settling over me like a heavy blanket, making everything feel surreal and distant, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. To my left sat my stepmother, Victoria, who'd married my father 4 years ago when I was 28. She wore an elaborate black Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and had been dabbing at her eyes with a designer lace handkerchief throughout the service, though I'd noticed the tears seemed to come and go at strategically convenient moments. Victoria was 47, 20 years younger than Dad, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of polished appearance that came from expensive maintenance. She'd been working as a hostess at Chez Laurent, Dad's favorite French restaurant, when they met. Within 6 months she'd moved into his house. Within a year they were married. The pastor was finishing his remarks about Dad's life, his service in the Navy during Vietnam, his successful accounting practice that he'd built from nothing, his love of fishing and woodworking, his dedication to his clients who'd trusted him with their financial futures for decades. What the pastor didn't mention, because most people didn't know, was Dad's incredible business acumen, his strategic real estate investments, or the substantial fortune he'd quietly built over 3 decades of careful planning and smart decisions. Most people in this room didn't know that Thomas Davis had died worth $15.2 million. I knew because I'd helped him build it. As the service concluded and people began to move toward the reception area in the adjacent hall, Victoria leaned close to me, her Chanel No. 5 perfume overwhelming in the small space between us. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but carried a tone I'd become familiar with over the past 4 years. "Emma, dear, I know this is an incredibly difficult time for you, but we really do need to discuss some practical matters." I turned to look at her, noting the calculating gleam in her eyes that she'd hidden so well during her marriage to my father, but which I'd caught glimpses of when she thought no one was watching. "What kind of practical matters, Victoria?" "Well, you know the will reading is scheduled for tomorrow morning at Harold Morrison's office, but I thought you should know ahead of time." She paused, glancing around to make sure no one was listening to our conversation. "Your father left everything to me. The house, all the investment accounts, the business assets, even his personal belongings. Everything." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, not from surprise, but from the satisfaction in her voice as she delivered what she clearly thought was devastating news. "Everything. I'm so sorry, darling. I know you were probably hoping for some kind of inheritance, but Thomas felt that since I was his wife and since you're already, well, established in your own little career." She let the sentence hang in the air like an insult wrapped in false sympathy. What Victoria didn't know, what she'd never bothered to discover despite 4 years of marriage to my father, was that I, Emma Davis, was the founder and CEO of Meridian Financial Solutions, a wealth management firm that controlled $3.8 billion in assets and served some of the most successful individuals and families on the West Coast. She thought I was a struggling financial advisor working out of a shared office space in a strip mall, barely making ends meet on small-time investment advice and insurance sales. For 4 years, I'd deliberately maintained this fiction. When Dad had first introduced me to Victoria at a family barbecue, when I'd seen the way she looked at his house and his car and calculated his worth in her head, I'd made the decision to keep my success completely private. I wanted to see what kind of person she really was when she thought I had nothing to offer and no power to threaten her plans. "I see," I said quietly, keeping my voice neutral. "Of course, I'll make sure you have some personal items, photographs, maybe some of his books or fishing equipment. But the financial assets, the house, the investment portfolio." Victoria shrugged with practiced sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, a wife's needs come first, and Thomas understood that I'll need security for my future." Before I could respond, someone tapped on the microphone at the front of the reception hall. Harold Morrison, Dad's lawyer for the past 15 years and one of his closest friends, was standing behind a small podium that had been set up near the flower arrangements. Harold was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention in courtrooms and boardrooms alike. He'd been handling Dad's legal affairs since before I graduated from college, and I'd worked with him extensively over the past 3 years on matters Victoria knew nothing about. Excuse me, everyone. I know this isn't the traditional time or place for this type of announcement, but given some questions that have arisen today, Thomas specifically asked me to clarify a few important matters regarding his estate immediately following the funeral service. I saw Victoria's eyes narrow slightly, and her grip tighten on her handkerchief. This clearly wasn't part of whatever plan she'd been developing. Harold pulled out a thick manila folder and cleared his throat, his voice carrying easily across the reception hall. As Thomas's attorney and the executor of his estate, I want to address some misconceptions that may be circulating among family members and friends. The room had gone progressively quieter as people realized something significant was about to be announced. Conversations trailed off, and faces turned toward Harold with curiosity and concern. First, I want to confirm for everyone present that Thomas Davis died with a verified net worth of approximately $15.2 million, including real estate holdings, investment accounts, business assets, and various other financial instruments. I heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath beside me, and saw her face flush slightly. She'd probably assumed Dad was worth maybe $3 to $4 million based on his lifestyle and the house. The actual number was clearly much higher than she'd calculated in her planning. Second, there have been some questions and assumptions about the distribution of these assets. I want to clarify that while Thomas did prepare a traditional will as a backup measure, the vast majority of his wealth was actually transferred to a comprehensive family trust that was established 3 years ago. My heart started beating faster. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, though under circumstances I'd never wanted to experience. The primary beneficiary of this trust is his daughter, Emma Davis, who will receive 90% of all assets, including the family home, investment portfolios, and business interests. Mrs. Victoria Davis, as his surviving spouse, will receive the remaining 10% of the estate plus their current marital residence and its contents. The silence in the room was complete and profound. I could feel every eye in the reception hall turning toward me, and the weight of their attention was almost overwhelming. Victoria's face had gone completely white, then flushed red, then white again. That's absolutely not possible, she stammered, her voice getting louder than appropriate for the setting. Harold looked directly at her with the kind of professional calm that came from decades of delivering difficult news. Mrs. Davis, I understand this may come as a surprise, but the trust was established at Emma's suggestion and with her substantial financial backing. She actually provided the initial funding that allowed your husband to make several key investment moves over the past 3 years. What do you mean, her financial backing? Victoria's voice was now loud enough that people throughout the hall were staring openly. Emma works at some little financial planning office. She drives a 10-year-old Honda. Harold consulted his notes. Mrs. Davis, Emma has been quietly managing and significantly funding her father's investment portfolio through her company, Meridian Financial Solutions. She's been the silent partner in virtually all of his business ventures since 2021. The room erupted in whispers and murmurs. I could see Dad's friends and colleagues looking at me with expressions ranging from surprise to admiration to newfound respect. Several people were pulling out their phones, probably Googling my company name. Victoria turned to stare at me, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process what she was hearing. Emma, what is he talking about? This is some kind of mistake. Some kind of joke. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, feeling the moment that I'd been preparing for over the past 3 years finally arriving. Victoria, it's not a joke. I'm not a struggling financial advisor. I run a wealth management firm that controls $3.8 billion in assets. That's completely impossible. I've seen your apartment. I've seen your car. I've seen how you dress. Harold, I said, turning to address the lawyer, would you mind explaining the specific details of the trust arrangement? Harold nodded and pulled out another document from his folder. Certainly. 3 years ago, Emma approached her father with a comprehensive business proposition. She offered to manage his existing investments, provide additional capital for expansion opportunities, and help him develop a more sophisticated financial strategy, with the understanding that she would be the primary beneficiary of any growth in the estate. But why would she do that? Called out someone from the crowd. I recognized the voice as belonging to Robert Chin, one of Dad's longtime clients and fishing buddies. I looked around the room at all these people who'd known Dad, who'd worked with him, who'd respected and trusted him with their own financial planning. Because I wanted to take care of my father. Because I wanted him to be able to enjoy his retirement without any financial worries. Because family takes care of family. Harold continued reading from the document. Under Emma's management and with her capital contributions, Thomas's portfolio grew from approximately $2.1 million to over $15 million. She funded his purchase of the lake house in Tahoe, the fishing boat, several investment properties in Sacramento and San Jose, and a diversified portfolio of blue-chip stocks and municipal bonds. Victoria was shaking her head frantically. No, this isn't right. This can't be right. Thomas never mentioned any of this to me. Not once in 4 years. Because he was protecting you, Victoria, I said quietly, my voice carrying across the now silent room. He knew exactly why you married him, and he didn't want you to know how much money there actually was. That's not true. I loved Thomas. I loved your father. Did you? Because the private investigator's report suggests a somewhat different story. Harold reached into his folder again and pulled out a thick envelope. Mrs. Davis, your husband was fully aware of your relationship with Marcus Webb. He knew about the joint bank account you opened with Mr. Webb 6 months ago. He knew about the life insurance policies you took out on his life without his knowledge. He knew about your consultations with 3 different divorce attorneys over the past year. Victoria's face cycled through several colors again, settling on a splotchy red. Thomas was being paranoid. He was imagining things. Those were just. What were they, Victoria? I asked, my voice remaining calm despite the anger building in my chest. Because the financial records show you've been systematically moving money into accounts Dad couldn't access. Because we have documentation of you meeting with insurance agents to discuss ways to increase his coverage. Because we have recordings of you telling Marcus Webb that you wouldn't have to wait much longer for your payday. The crowd was listening with complete fascination now, the funeral atmosphere entirely forgotten in the drama unfolding before them. I could see people taking notes on their phones, probably planning to share this story for years to come. Emma, Victoria's voice was desperate now with an edge of panic that she couldn't quite control. Even if some of this is true, I'm his legal wife. I have rights. I have legal standing. You can't just cut me out. You're absolutely right. You do have rights, and Dad made sure those rights were respected. You get 10% of the estate, which amounts to approximately $1.5 million, plus you get to keep the house and all its contents. Additionally, Dad's life insurance policy, which he maintains separate from the trust, leaves you an additional $500,000. But that's nothing compared to the $13.7 million that I'm inheriting? You're absolutely right. It's not even close. Harold stepped forward again, consulting yet another document. There's one final matter that needs to be addressed publicly, Mrs. Davis. Your husband also asked me to inform you and everyone present that he was aware of the forged documents you submitted to Kellerman and Associates in an attempt to have his will altered. Victoria's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. This is absolutely insane. This is character assassination. You can't prove any of these accusations. Actually, we can. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen, which displayed a paused video feed. Dad had security cameras installed in his study 6 months ago, after he noticed documents had been moved. We have footage of you going through his files, photographing important papers, and meeting with that attorney in Phoenix who specializes in contesting wills and challenging estate plans. The room was dead silent now. Even the catering staff had stopped their work to listen to the confrontation unfolding. We also have phone records showing regular communication between you and Marcus Webb, including several calls made from Dad's house while he was at doctor's appointments. We have bank records showing the gradual transfer of funds from joint accounts to accounts in your name only. We have documentation of you meeting with 3 different attorneys to discuss divorce proceedings and asset division. Victoria looked around the room desperately, seeing nothing but shocked and disapproving faces staring back at her. This isn't over, she said finally, her voice shaking with rage and humiliation. I'll contest this. I'll fight every single aspect of this arrangement. I'll hire the best lawyers money can buy. Harold cleared his throat diplomatically. Mrs. Davis, you're certainly welcome to pursue legal action if you feel that's appropriate. However, I should inform you that the trust documents are ironclad and were prepared by some of the most experienced estate planning attorneys in the state. Additionally, your husband's mental capacity was thoroughly documented by multiple physicians, including 2 independent neurologists, specifically to prevent any challenges based on competency. What does that mean exactly? It means that any attempt to contest the will or challenge the trust may result in the complete voiding of your inheritance under the terms of the agreement. Your $2 million total inheritance is conditional on your acceptance of the terms as written. Victoria stared at Harold, then at me, then around the room full of people who now understood exactly what kind of person she was and what kind of scheme she'd been planning. Fine, she said finally, her voice cold and brittle. Fine. But I want absolutely nothing to do with this family anymore. I want nothing to do with any of you. That's entirely your choice to make, I replied calmly. But Victoria, Dad really did love you despite everything he discovered about your plans. Despite the betrayal, despite the deception, despite the fact that you were planning to leave him. He wanted to make sure you were taken care of financially. That's the only reason you're getting anything at all. She gathered her expensive purse and began walking toward the exit, her designer heels clicking sharply against the funeral parlor's polished floor. She paused at the door and turned back one final time. Emma, I have to ask you something. What's that? How long have you known? About my relationship with Marcus, about the insurance policies, about my plans to contest the will? About your plans to challenge the will and your meetings with divorce attorneys? About 6 months. About your relationship with Marcus Webb? About a year. About your real reasons for marrying Dad and your intentions from the very beginning? From the moment I met you. And you said nothing? You let this charade continue for 4 years. I was hoping I was wrong about you. Dad was hoping the same thing. We both wanted to believe that you might actually learn to love him for who he was. And when you realized you weren't wrong, we started documenting everything. We started protecting the assets. And we started planning for exactly this scenario. Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something like genuine regret flash across her face before it hardened again into resentment. You know what the really crazy part is, Emma? If you just told me who you really were, if I'd known about your money, your success, your company, I might have actually tried to be a real stepmother to you. No, Victoria. If you'd known about my money, you would have tried to manipulate me the same way you manipulated Dad. The difference is I would have seen it coming. She left without another word, and the room slowly began to return to something resembling normal conversation levels as people processed what they'd just witnessed. Harold approached me with the trust documents and several other legal folders. Emma, I'm genuinely sorry this had to happen today of all days. I know your father would have preferred to handle this privately. Dad wanted it this way, Harold. He said if something happened to him, he wanted Victoria to understand the consequences of her choices immediately, in front of witnesses, so there could be no misunderstanding about the facts. And the business assets? Your father's accounting practice? What are your plans for those? I looked around the room at Dad's colleagues and former clients, people who'd trusted him with their financial futures and respected him for his integrity and business judgment. Dad's accounting practice will continue operating under the same name. I'll hire a qualified CPA to manage the day-to-day operations, but I want to maintain all of his existing client relationships and honor the commitments he made. And his real estate investments will be folded into Meridian's portfolio. Dad and I had been planning to make our business partnership public eventually anyway. This just accelerates that timeline. What about the lake house and the boat? I'll keep them. Dad and I spent some of our best times together at Lake Tahoe. I'm not ready to give that up. Over the next 2 hours, as the reception continued, people approached me with condolences, questions about Dad's business dealings, and expressions of amazement about the revelations they'd just witnessed. Several of his long-term clients expressed interest in working with Meridian Financial Solutions, having been impressed by the dramatic growth of Dad's portfolio under my management. My father's best friend and longtime fishing partner, Robert Chin, pulled me aside near the end of the reception. Emma, I have to ask you something that's been bothering me. Of course, Mr. Chin. Why did your father marry Victoria if he knew what she was really like? If he suspected her motives from the beginning? I considered the question carefully. Because he was lonely after being widowed for so many years, and she made him feel young and attractive again. Because he thought maybe if he gave her financial security and genuine affection, she might learn to care about him as a person. And did she? Do you think she ever really cared about him? I think she cared about him more than she expected to, and definitely more than she wanted to. But not enough to stop planning for his death. Not enough to be faithful to him. Not enough to choose love over money when it came down to it. Do you think he was happy during those 4 years? Yes, I do. Because he knew I was successful and financially secure, so he didn't have to worry about my future. Because he knew his legacy would continue through me and through the business we built together. Because he spent his last few years enjoying life instead of working constantly and worrying about money. And do you think he suspected how this would all play out? I think he hoped Victoria would surprise us. I think he wanted to believe she was better than her actions suggested. But yes, I think he knew exactly how this day would go. As I drove home that evening in my modest Honda Civic, the same car I'd been driving for 8 years, kept deliberately to maintain my cover, I thought about the phone call Dad had made to me 6 months earlier. Emma, sweetheart, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, Dad. What's on your mind? If something happens to me, a heart attack, an accident, anything sudden, will you be okay? Financially, emotionally, in every way that matters. Dad, I'll be absolutely fine. More than fine. You know that. Good. Because I need to know that whatever Victoria does, whatever she tries to take, whatever legal challenges she might mount, you'll still be completely secure. What do you mean? What kind of challenges? I mean, I think my wife is planning to become my widow sooner rather than later, and I think she's been planning it for quite a while. The conversation that followed had led to the trust arrangement, the security cameras, the private investigator, and months of careful documentation. Dad had spent his final months quietly gathering evidence of Victoria's betrayal while also setting up comprehensive safeguards to protect both of us. He'd also spent those months teaching me about his client relationships, his business philosophy, and his long-term vision for the accounting practice he'd built over 30 years. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria had married Dad thinking she was securing her financial future by attaching herself to a successful but modestly wealthy man. She'd planned and schemed to maximize her inheritance from someone she assumed was worth maybe $3 to $4 million at most. What she never realized was that she'd actually married into a family worth hundreds of times more than she'd imagined. If she'd been genuine, if she'd actually loved Dad and proven herself trustworthy, if she'd tried to build a real relationship with me, she would have eventually inherited everything alongside me. Dad had even mentioned the possibility of updating the trust to include her more substantially if she proved herself over time. Instead, her greed, deception, and betrayal had cost her a fortune she'd never even known existed. 2 weeks later, Victoria moved out of Dad's house and relocated to Phoenix with Marcus Webb. She took her $2 million total inheritance and vanished from our lives entirely, though Harold heard through legal channels that Marcus had convinced her to invest most of the money in a series of get-rich-quick schemes that had promptly failed. I kept Dad's house for several months, spending weekends there going through his belongings, deciding what to preserve and what to donate to charity. In his study, hidden behind a false back in his desk drawer, I found a letter addressed to me in his careful handwriting. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then Harold has done his job and Victoria has learned that actions have consequences. I hope you don't think I was too harsh with her. She made her choices and I simply made sure those choices led exactly where they deserved to lead. I want you to know that the past 3 years working with you and watching you build something extraordinary have been the absolute best years of my life since your mother died. You've exceeded every expectation I ever had, not just as a businesswoman, but as a daughter and as a human being. The money doesn't matter in the end. What matters is that you understand you never have to compromise your values for financial security. You never have to accept less than you deserve from people who claim to love you. You never have to pretend to be smaller than you are to make other people comfortable. Victoria thought she was manipulating a lonely old man for his modest nest egg. She never realized she was competing with someone who'd already won everything that mattered. I love you more than words can express, and I'm prouder of you than you'll ever know. All my love, Dad. Please check the safety deposit box at First National. There's one more surprise waiting for you there. The surprise turned out to be stock certificates for a small tech company that Dad had invested in 20 years earlier on a whim. The company had been bought by Apple 6 months before Dad's death, making the shares worth an additional $3.2 million. I kept that letter in my desk drawer at Meridian Financial Solutions, reading it whenever I needed to remember that sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is to protect what they built and continue what they started. 6 months after the funeral, Victoria called me out of the blue. "Emma, I want to apologize." "For what specifically?" "For everything. For underestimating you, for what I did to your father, for being so greedy and short-sighted and stupid." "Victoria, Dad forgave you before he died. That's why you received anything at all from his estate." "I know. And I wanted to tell you that Marcus left me. He took most of the money and disappeared to Mexico with some woman he met online." "I'm sorry to hear that happened to you." "Are you really? Are you actually sorry?" I considered the question seriously. "I'm sorry that you're experiencing the consequences of trusting someone who only wanted your money. I'm not sorry that you're learning what it feels like to be used by someone you thought cared about you." "That's fair." "Emma, can I ask you something else?" "What?" Do you think your father would forgive me if he knew how genuinely sorry I am now?" "Dad already knew you'd be sorry eventually. That's why his final gift to you was the chance to learn from your mistakes with enough money to start over completely if you choose to do so wisely." "What do you mean?" $2 million is enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life if you're smart about managing it. It's enough to build something real and meaningful if you're willing to work for it and make good choices. What you do with that opportunity is entirely up to you." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "Emma, would it be possible? Could I maybe work for your company somehow? I'm good with people when I'm not being manipulative, and I understand now what real financial planning looks like." I thought about Dad's letter, about second chances and the difference between justice and mercy, about the possibility of redemption even for people who'd made terrible choices. "Send me your resume, Victoria. Take some courses in financial planning and get proper certifications. Show me that you've learned something from this experience. Let's see what you've actually learned and whether you're capable of change. You'd really consider hiring me? After everything I did?" Dad believed people could change if they genuinely wanted to. I'm willing to give you the chance to prove him right. 3 months later, Victoria sent me a resume along with certificates from a financial planning program and a heartfelt letter explaining what she'd learned about herself and her priorities. I hired her as a junior associate, with the understanding that any hint of her old behavior would result in immediate termination. She turned out to be an excellent employee, hardworking, honest, and surprisingly good at helping clients understand complex financial concepts. 6 months later, I promoted her to senior associate. A year after that, she became one of our most trusted client advisors. Sometimes the best revenge isn't punishment. Sometimes it's giving someone the opportunity to become better than they were, knowing they might not take it but hoping they will. And sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property or investments. It's the knowledge that you never have to pretend to be less than you are to earn someone else's love, and that the people who truly matter will see your worth regardless of what you appear to own.